Greetings, welcome to the Transforming Assessment series for the 4th of May 2022. Today's session is Designing Authentic Exam Questions, and our speaker today is Raechel Wight from the University of Technology, Sydney, Australia. So Raechel, would you like to begin, please?
Great, thank you, Matthew, and thank you very much for inviting me here today. So I'm from the University of Technology, Sydney, and a PhD candidate there. And as we start our session today, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose traditional lands I've got the privilege to be presenting from today. And I'd like to pay my respect to the elders past, present and emerging as the traditional custodians of these lands. I'd also like to extend my respect to the First Nations owners of the lands upon which people in Australia might be joining us from. And if you are joining us from Australia and you do know the traditional owners of the lands upon which you're on today, feel free to pop that in your acknowledgement in the chat if you feel comfortable. And I'd also like to send a big hi to everyone who is joining us from overseas. It's fantastic that we can do this virtually and have a global connected community. So today, a bit of an overview of what we're going to cover. What I'm going to do is give you an example of how I've developed a much more authentic online quiz in both in Blackboard and in Canvas. So I'm showing you the Blackboard version today. That is a little bit more authentic than multiple choice questions. And then what I'm going to be doing is just going through a lot of the design process that I went through in terms of designing them, and a lot of things that you'll have to think about if you're wanting to design more authentic exam questions, including things like quality assurance. So a little bit about me. So as I said, I am a PhD candidate at the University of Technology, Sydney, and a sessional academic there. Now, before I did my PhD or started my PhD, I did work as a digital publisher for an online textbook company where I did have a lot of experience designing authentic online questions. But that being said, I did come out of that straight from uni. So I was pretty naive when I started that job. So I think designing authentic questions can be something that anyone can do, providing you're just very open to the possibilities. A lot of this work does come also from my PhD research, where I'm looking at the effectiveness of online quizzes, particularly online quizzes that are voluntary, used for formative assessment, and to see whether that helps the students learn and then is reflected in their exam performance. Now, I have got some interesting results from that. Fortunately, I did find that using the quizzes is associated with performance. But digging a little deeper, it does depend actually on how the students use the quiz. So for example, I looked at whether the students use the quiz as a self-test, where they would have to go into the quiz and at least pass the quiz. And then I compared that to the students who would go into the quiz, but wouldn't actually achieve more than 50% in that quiz. So whether they're really using it more to access the solutions as a worked example. Now, the results that I found was that it did sort of depend on how the students use the quiz. So for the students who, for the topic of the threshold concept of recording journal entries, which is a threshold concept in accounting, students definitely needed to go in and demonstrate a pass in the quiz. And this was particularly important for those students who were low achievers. But for some of the other topics, the students didn't need to demonstrate that they needed to pass. So they could just go in and use the quiz as a worked example, just accessing the solution. But they did really need to make a genuine attempt of that. So the closer that they did get to the 50%, the better they would perform in their exams on the similar topic. I've also been quite privileged to receive a few awards for the work that I've done here in the online quiz space, as well as a few other things as well. So I've received quite a few UTS Learning and Teaching Awards from my university, and also 2 national awards, including an Australian Awards for University Teaching Citation last year, which in Australia is quite a big recognition, especially considering I'm a casual academic here. So what I'm going to show you now is just some of the design possibilities that can be achieved through your learning management system. But first, why? What's wrong with multiple choice questions? I could talk about this for quite a while, but one of the main reasons is that it's not really an authentic piece of assessment that's required of people in the field. Apart from someone who might be paid to do market research, I'm not really aware of any organisations or any jobs that require you to sit down and answer a multiple choice question. But there are also some interesting and difficulties with using them for learning in that students can guess the correct answer depending on how they're designed. And also sometimes the signals within the multiple choice questions can lead the student to the correct answer. But also some of the cueing signals, if they're exposed to them, the students can actually learn the incorrect thing. The other thing that's difficult with multiple choice questions is that it might actually be testing high levels of language proficiency. So this is especially important when we have really large diverse classes, like we do in accounting, that the multiple choice question might be testing the students' knowledge of English rather than the students' knowledge of what they're trying to demonstrate. So the solution is to design much more authentic quizzes. So what I have here is an example of a quiz that I designed that was designed to go through the process of what we call a bank reconciliation, which is something that students need to do within accounting. And so this was a few questions that were worked together where students were required to have a look at the numbers in last month's bank reconciliation statement and then check that that comes into the current bank statement. And then if they see both of the numbers, that they can mark them both as reconciled. The next step in the process is that they then need to check all the remaining numbers in the bank statement and check that they are matching the numbers in the ledger account. And again, checking that both of them are reconciled. Once that's done, what students then need to do is anything that wasn't reconciled, the students need to identify what those unreconciled numbers represented. And from all the information in the previous questions, they then needed to prepare a bank reconciliation statement for the current month using the information from the prior questions. And then they also need to prepare what we call journal entries in accounting, once again, using the information that they identified in the prior questions. So I thought I'd just give you a second to pause and just imagine what authentic activity you would like your students to do. So when you're doing this, putting things online, it really needs to be procedural and have a definitive correct answer, because of course, all of this comes down to ones and zeros of binary code, and so it does need to be answered correct or not. I'll just give you a virtual minute to think about that, but if you'd like to post any questions in the chat in the meantime while you're thinking about that, feel free. I've got someone commenting that they can vouch for the authenticity of that. I was an ex-auditor as well, so yes. Cool, yeah, calculating a drug dose based on a person's body weight. Yeah, that could be something that could absolutely be authentically put in with randomization for each student. Does not necessarily have to need to have a single correct answer. If it's automatically marked, you'll just need to check how your learning management system will deal with that. So some of the numerical stuff, they can have ranges that they will be able to automatically mark correct. But of course, no, you don't necessarily have to have a correct answer, but you might then have to actually manually mark them. Cool, so designing a data acquisition system to read a specific temperature sensor. Yep, I'm not exactly sure what that is, but yeah. So we've got lots of ideas of what we could do here. Did I design this directly in Blackboard or use other software? Yeah, I did it in Blackboard. So the only other software I used was Excel, and I'll go on to sort of show you about that now. So how did I actually go about designing this? So when I was designing that set of questions, I started with a pedagogy. So I started with, what did I want my students to demonstrate? I wanted them to demonstrate the process of the bank reconciliation and them actually physically marking things off in a way that could just be automatically marked by a system. What I then had to do is I then had to think about how the students are going to input their answers and looking at what type of questions could I use. So whether it would be calculation questions or drop down boxes. Could I use numerical randomization, which I have used in numerical randomization in some other quizzes, but I couldn't use it in this quiz because Blackboard and Canvas won't be able to take the randomization from one question and feed it into the following question. So there were constraints within the learning management system that I did have to work around in designing these questions. Also, I would have loved to have had drop down and a numerical answer that you type in the same question, but that question type is not available in Blackboard or Canvas, but I would love it if it was. So working within the constraints, I basically, for that quiz, most of them were drop down boxes that I chose. I also had to think about whether all the questions were being presented on the same page. So in that quiz, I did, because they needed to use the answers from one question to feed into the next. And I did design to have each piece of, I guess in the old days, piece of paper that the students had to compare. I designed them as separate questions so the students could kind of see that they were separate rather than having to scroll right to the top to instructions and down. Oh, Moodle closed questions will allow a mix of selected and typed responses within the one question. Fantastic. Hopefully we can get those in some of the other learning management systems. So you also want to consider whether you want them all on the same page or over multiple changes. So if they are on the same page, some of the answers to one question might give hints to other questions. So I have got a different quiz where you answered the first bit of the question and then the student had to use that into the second and to the third and the fourth bit. And the problem was if they got the first one wrong, they would naturally get the rest of them wrong as well. So that quiz, because it was for learning, I did design that over multiple pages, and I did not allow the student to backtrack because on the next page they would be given the answer for the first part anyway. And we wanted to see where they were going wrong and what kind of mistakes that they were making when they're learning, so we can help tailor our teaching for the students. So that's what you want to think through when there's any carry-through errors. Now, in terms of designing these kind of quizzes, it does take time. So I know that there were certain quizzes that I designed that I was like, this is what I want them to achieve. And I just had to keep on thinking of it, how I could design it, how I could put it together. But if you have it sort of in the back of your mind and just keep coming back to it when you're making dinner or whatever, sometimes you just wake up and go, oh, okay, that's how I can actually solve that problem. So in terms of implementing the quiz in the learning management system, I mainly designed the questions in Excel. And then I literally just copied the tables from Excel into the learning management system. Now, I did use a little bit of HTML coding, only because in accounting, we do need like double lines in some of the cell borders. So I couldn't really, there was no sort of thing that I could click on to do that. So I had to code that a little bit. But it wasn't really extensive. A lot of it was just using the what you see is what you get tools within Blackboard and Canvas. The other thing that you want to really think about is instructions on how to answer the question is really important. So for numerical work, you certainly want to be looking at the number of decimal places because sometimes the system will mark the student wrong if they haven't supplied the correct amount of decimal places, even though their process is correct. And we do know that if students get frustrated, it really does impede their learning. So you might give them an example, an instruction to select the correct answer from a drop-down box. And also for written instructions, you certainly want to be asking them how to structure their answer. So you might have, one paragraph for this, paragraph 2 for this. It will just help when you're doing online quizzes. It will also help the markers mark and identify where the student thinks they've answered the particular part of the question. You also want to be having a think about what order to answer the question in. So, and what I mean by that is that for this particular question, there are 1, 2, 3, 4 different what we call journal entries that the student had to do. And of course, they could have put these in any particular order that the student wanted. But the constraint of the learning management system was that you could only sort of put one correct answer for each of these items. So there was an instruction there that all the journal entries must be recorded in the same order as they appear in the bank reconciliation statement. And so then the student knows which order to do it in, and that way this can be automatically marked by the system. Just some other considerations about implementing the quiz. Just need to be very careful about the presentation of things like the tables, numbers, text wrapping, or scrolling. So sometimes I've seen a table where some of the columns, you actually need to scroll across to see the numbers there. And that's not necessarily obvious until the student hovers over it. So you're either going to need to put an instruction to tell them to do that, or perhaps design it so that some of the columns are a little bit narrower and force the width of the columns. Just so remembering all design elements are informative. Now, because the quizzes that I designed were actually for student learning, but of course this can be designed for online exams as well. When you're doing online exams, of course, you might not need extra feedback, but if these quizzes are formative for students' learning, you certainly want to have the feedback of what the student answered correct and not. But also for some of the quizzes that I designed, I did have elaborate feedback that explained how that question should be answered and why the answer was correct. And this explanation was really essential for those novice learners who might not be able to figure out what they've done right or wrong just from the correct or incorrect feedback. So your higher achievers will be able to do that, but certainly novice learners can struggle a little bit with that. So in terms of having a look at the particular question types and things that we need to think about them, text entry questions, using them for quiz design, I would really be advising to manually mark any text entry questions unless very specific with the instructions that you give to the students. So I'd avoid text entry for very short answers. Instead, I'd be using drop-down boxes. And so that way we avoid issues of the student being marked wrong if they use, say, UK versus US versus Australian English spelling. Also, you just want to check, how capital letters, if they use them or not, how the learning management system marks those. When you're doing formula calculation questions, this is what I really advise to do. They are excellent to avoid issues of academic integrity, but you do have to be careful when you're designing them. So a couple of things you need to think about is that the numbers that you select that need to be kind of reasonable, and you want to design them so they avoid student confusion. So sometimes what I would do is, sometimes if I was wanting a number that would come out as a whole number, not a decimal place, sometimes I'd actually hard code the 1,000 and just randomize the 1 to the 99,000. And that way I could then force the randomization to be a whole number to avoid student confusion. But you just have to be if you do that, you just have to be aware that you have to code that into the formula that you use to calculate the correct answer. So you always just need to make sure just to times the random number by 1,000 in the formula. The numbers that you choose, make sure that they are sort of proportionate and realistic so that when your answer comes out, it's not something that the student will go, that can't be right. And you need to very carefully check your ranges. Not so much when you're adding and multiplying, but definitely when you're subtracting and dividing. You need to check for negative results, whether that makes sense for the question that you're answering and how the learning management system will cope with that. Yeah. So I would sort of, look at the maximum and the minimum of your different ranges and see how they overlap, and just double checking whether the maximum and the minimum of, especially the subtractions, whether they would result in something that's a bit strange. So this is where I'd be using an Excel spreadsheet just to check all my ranges, just to make sure that everything works properly. I probably mentioned this before, but always provide instructions for decimal places, or just to say enter your number as a whole number. You want to check whether dollars or percentages are allowed in the fields, because sometimes in accounting we tell students, what is the dollar value, and so they might try and put the dollar value in. I think these days they tend to strip them out and just have them as a number, but if they don't strip them out, you probably want instructions to not including a dollar or percentage. And of course, if there are lots of subparts of questions, you need to think about how the student could round it. So for example, in accounting, sometimes several subparts, and if a student uses Microsoft Excel software, or they use a calculator and round some of the numbers earlier, they can get quite different answers, even though they've got the correct process. So you either want to instruct them to perhaps only round at the last calculation, or even better, to design the numbers so it does minimize those decimal places. Sometimes when I've been designing, I guess, exam questions, sometimes you might need to just have a look and manually award marks for partially correct answers, although that does get difficult when the questions are randomized. But that's just something to think about. So I thought I'd a bit of a pause of having a think about what quiz formats might suit your authentic activity, and you can post any questions in the chat. There's a few that have come through, which is cool. So I just got a question. Which of one of the elements of authenticity have you used in the design process? So the design process for the quiz that I showed you, so that was an authentic process that students need to go through to understand the concept of a bank reconciliation process. So that was where it was sort of authentic tasks that students need to do. Although I must confess, these days a lot of these things will be done by computer software, but we need to make sure that students understand what's happening behind the software. So going back to the manual way these things used to be done is one way to get them to really understand what that software is doing for them. Cool. Thank you for the combination of question types, the link in to the LMS. That's great to hear. Yeah, I'll chase those things up. Cool. Okay, so some other design considerations. So if you are doing summative exams, some of the things are just that you would use normally. So the number of marks per question reflecting the difficulty and the complexity, the number of steps involved in the calculation, the relative weighting to other questions in the exam, and maybe sort of thinking about whether you give partial marks depending on how your questions are designed. Question pools, of course, are great to strengthen academic integrity, but just make sure that you are using the same level of learning difficulty or the learning objective in the question pool. I have seen question pools where it's got one question that's a very simple calculation and another question that is really complicated. And I have heard students talk about that. They're like, oh yeah, I got the easy version, I got the hard version. And they do sort of recognise that that's an equity issue for them. So I would really carefully design those question pools so it does ensure equity for all the students, and just making very small changes of, say, advantages and disadvantages and things like that. Formative practice quizzes. So these are great to design and to give your students. They both provide practice for the content, but also how to use the learning management system if you're doing online exams, as a lot of us are these days. I have done, in terms of my PhD research, I know that designing your own practice quizzes is time consuming and it does cost, time is money. But the research that I've done is that if you do design them yourself and you publicise that to your students, they will actually use them. So there's a few studies that I've, and including my own research, that somewhere between maybe 30 to 80% of students will use the quizzes that you design, where it's probably between, I don't know, something up to about maybe 30, 40% of students will only use the publishers' test banks. So they certainly are used much more than the publishers' questions. And they do, of course, if they're if you have designed them, they're going to be much more constructively aligned to the assessments that you have. I'm a big fan of providing practice quizzes because we all know that the testing effect, where students actually go in and make an attempt at a question, is really effective for their learning. But you certainly want to provide that feedback that's a little bit beyond just the correct or incorrect. So detailing of how the answer is to come about and why the things are correct. And that's particularly important for novice learners who do need that elaborated feedback to help their learning. So quality assurance considerations. This is really important for automatically marked exams, just to make sure that they're marking correctly. So I would always recommend getting someone else to get 100% on your test. If it's a formative quiz, the students will do that for you. They will question your answers and you can just go in and make changes to it. But it's really important for the quizzes or the exams that are for marks. If you can't get someone else to do it, I really would advise just to wait a week and actually physically do the quiz yourself, assuming that there are errors, because it's quite easy to make errors either in the writing or the coding, just to make sure that it is correct before it goes out to the students. I'd also just time how long it takes you to get 100% and then at least double that time for the students, because we generally know, okay, that question, this is how I do it, but the students do have to think about, okay, what's the theory I apply, what's the process, and they do have to take a lot longer to think about things than we do, obviously. Now, what I would also do is, after sort of exams, I'd be looking at downloading the detail of the student answers and just double check for any systematic errors in your grades. I have seen, this was not when I was a subject coordinator, but I did have a look at some answers and I found that, oh, why is only 10% of students getting this particular answer correct? And it turns out that was because it was coded incorrectly of what the correct answer was. So the only students who got it correct were the ones who randomly guessed the wrong answer. So if you do pick those up, you can actually just check that marking before it goes out to the students. But really importantly, I guess, especially if you've got formative questions, but also just if students do come back to you after your exams, just learn from them what questions they're asking, because with online assessments, it's really important to be quite specific in terms of how you're answering the questions, what are the underlying assumptions, especially when things are going to be automatically graded. And just to be really open to those assumptions, because, and this is one thing I learned when I was at the digital publisher, you think that that's clear, but if someone can interpret it in a slightly different way, it's our responsibility to acknowledge that and to get rid of those assumptions and just make them clearer, especially when things are going to be automatically marked. So I know that this was an hour session, but I kind of figure everyone I'm a big thing of doing things relatively quickly and to the point. And this gives you some time to ask any questions, and also if you don't have any more questions, to go and do something more. So thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. There's an active discussion in the text chat. Just for Vikish, yes, we will share the slides via our website along with the session recording. So let's just scroll up to see if there is other questions. Somebody did ask, I seem to remember, what were the aspects of authenticity that were being used? Perhaps in reference to your PhD when you defined authenticity. I'm just trying to find where the question was. Gosh, the text chat is too big.
Yeah, I've got it here. 5:16 p.m. So it was looking at of what is something that students will need to be able to demonstrate, and actually get them to go through the process of actually doing that sort of bank reconciliation, as opposed to asking them, what is the definition of an outstanding check or things like that.
Yep. Another question I noticed was, did you design it all in Blackboard? I assume you use Canvas. Is that UTS's system now, or did you use Blackboard?
So this was actually designed in Canvas. So the screenshots I gave you were they were designed in Blackboard when we were using Blackboard, but we did transfer them over to Canvas, and I have also used Canvas as well. So you can design them in both. Canvas, there was one quiz that we couldn't get working in Canvas because some of the settings in Canvas are a little bit more restrictive in Blackboard. Blackboard was better in the sense of it allowed you more design choices, but Blackboard was worse in the sense that when you were actually coding and putting your questions in Blackboard, why do anything in one click when you can have to do it in 20? So you'd have to go through lots of different pages, and so Blackboard was much more clunky, as we know, whereas Canvas, everything sort of would be on the one page and you could sort of design it. But most things you could do in both.
Things with less options are normally easier to use.
Yes.
Yeah. What else have we got? Okay, so Peter B's made a comment. Authenticity to me means relating to the job tasks that a graduate would eventually do in the workplace, and I dare say that's the approach you've taken, Raechel.
Yeah. So students, if they are an auditor, so I mean that was exactly what I needed to do as an auditor, of getting this information and physically checking them and to make sure that the bank reconciliation was done correctly. So that's kind of where it came from. Was that's what I'd have to do as an auditor.
Yeah. And some people may be clued into the the academic literature on definitions of authenticity and assessment, such as Wiggins' list from 94 or 84 or whenever it was, way back then, and the idea of an authentic test.
Yeah. I know it's a little bit. Yes, I mean there is an authentic exam is not necessarily authentic, but I guess it's more of something that's a little bit more authentic than
there's degrees of it. It's a continuum, right? It's not a switch.
No.
Yeah. I mean, and I think. I would agree that you can have authentic exam questions that are still exam, because it's about taking on the characteristics of the complexity, of the characteristics of, as you said, what the person is going to be doing in the profession with respect to the questions you're asking. It doesn't have to be real as in real world completely, but at least it has some relationship. And I think explaining that to the students as well, so that they don't get too skeptical about things, is to say, hey, we realize this can't be 100% real, but here's the elements that are real. Here are the relationships between the theory, what we're doing here, and the real world practice. And I think that also helps as well.
Yes, absolutely. Because students won't necessarily automatically realise that, because kind of by definition they've probably not had experience at working. So yeah, bringing those kind of things to their attention is certainly useful.
Yeah. Okay, there were some more questions popping up. Have you had any issues with student motivation carrying out these quizzes? That was from Vikish.
What not students? We had lots of students use them. So, but that was also because we did continually promote them. So basically, in all of the the interactive workshops, in the tutorials, we would promote them and say, hey, look, these are really good for you to test your knowledge. And I guess because we also said, they're really good practice for what you're going to be seeing in the exam. And so I think that was motivation for them to go, okay, well, this is going to be practice for the exam. So we did find that they would attempt them. And just, I mean, this was for a course of, we have about 1,500 in first semester and about 500 in second semester. So it's a really large first year course.
Yep. Okay, some more questions. I'm not sure. Are you able to see the bottom of the text chat? Let's just... From Kerry, I'm interested in the PhD research. I get that students with good course outcomes are correlated with serious formative quiz attempts, but is that a causal relationship? That's the big question. Do you know?
Yes, I mean, with any kind of statistical, it's very, unless you're doing, the short answer is you cannot tell if it's a causal relationship, because the way to do a causal relationship would be doing an experiment, and of course then that would take them out of what they would normally do. So and so then if you're not doing an experiment, then it's like, well, it's difficult to have the causal relationship. So no, it's not, you can't necessarily make a statement of causality there, just through the limitation of it being a quasi-experimental study. But we can just have a look at these things and just say, okay, there are correlations and different ways that the different higher low achievers did use the quiz was quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, Alice has commented just a couple of questions down, and is it the keen students who would do well anyway to do the quizzes? We're not going to know, as you said, unless we've got a controlled experiment, and that's fundamentally, I guess, the issue with most educational research. We look at patterns and try to draw from those. I don't think we'll ever prove X equals Y. It's not maths, it's humans.
It is very difficult to do. That being said, I did do construct a sensitivity test where I compared where I basically compared the same student where they did the quiz and the same student where they did not do a quiz, where a quiz was available, and their exam performance on it. And I did find that when that student did the quiz, that student did go better than when they did not do the quiz. So I did kind of try to address those issues of self-selection bias within the research there as well.
Well done. Tim Hunt's got a good suggestion. In film drama, they talk about getting the audience to suspend disbelief to get the most out of the experience. Perhaps he suggests that this is something we could do as well. I wonder if we could usefully use a similar concepts. It needs to be authentic enough, and I would agree, that we can persuade the students to suspend their disbelief and go with it. I mean, my comment to that would be, communicating, talking to the students about what we're trying to achieve by doing these activities, the metacognition side of things, saying, yeah, we know it's not 100%, but these are the aspects that we think are going to help you in your future profession. In fact, it was in a workshop session we had today in my university, and people were talking about this same idea of getting students, communicate with students about expectations of assessment and things like that, and having that discussion with students is more likely to have them engage with things.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fantastic fantastic comment and idea of suspending their disbelief, and just to sort of recognizing the limitations of what we're doing, but we're trying to do our best to bring that authenticity in to help them in the future.
Vikesh has asked the question, is there a way on these LMS to rank questions according to their difficulty? Well, my experience of Moodle, yes and no. You have to do the questions, get the statistics, and then you'll be
Yeah.
able to rank them. But to do so in advance, you could put, you'd have to use your academic judgment to know that this question is a difficult one. The other question is an easy one, and that third one over there is a medium difficulty one. But you could then confirm that with the quiz statistics that you can get. At least I know you can do that in Moodle. I did suggest
Yeah.
before, and you were right, Raechel, about the stratification of the random banks. I suggest you need to do a pool for topic A, a pool for topic B, and a pool for topic C, but you also have to stratify by difficulty. And you can
Yes.
do that in most tools. You just have to create separate question banks. And when you're doing your quiz,
Yep.
particularly in Moodle, you insert a random question and then you choose from the appropriate question bank.
Yep.
So yeah, the trick is to create a bunch of question banks by topic, by difficulty, and then
Yep.
just insert based on that, rather than having all the questions in the exam in one big giant pool and then randomizing the whole lot. Because then if you
No.
to do the latter suggestion, you end up with unfair exams across topics and difficulties for students.
Yep.
So
Yeah. Absolutely. Yep. Creating those pools. Yeah, you can do them both in Blackboard and Canvas as well. Yep.
yeah, I think most LMSs have that, and most quizzing, decent quizzing tools would have a randomization feature where you can probably build separate pools or categories depending on
Yep.
what they call them.
Yep. Yep.
Any other comments or questions, folks? I'm just going to scroll up the questions to see if I missed any. Not at this point. The other thing is I've noticed in different disciplines, people use questions and exams differently. For example, in medicine, they have what they call them, they're multi-structured multiple choice questions that they claim are quite reasonably authentic, reasonably rigorous.
Mm-hmm.
I know in psychology, at least in my university, they really love their MCQ exams.
Yep. Seen
They
them.
apply their statistical tests to the nth degree on those MCQs. They've verified them, and from that point of view, they feel they're very solid. Whereas in other disciplines, perhaps, in arts or social sciences and things, they may have quite a different perspective. So I think, the discipline history, the discipline tradition also comes into play here when we're talking about, what people consider to be good exams or even authentic exams from that matter. So have you had any, particularly in your PhD research, Raechel, have you any thoughts about that disciplinarity, that differences?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly does feed into what you do and what you design and what is appropriate for the discipline. Yeah, I mean, I'm someone who actually personally has a very, very broad educational background. I hold a Bachelor of Visual Arts. I'm a group fitness instructor, and at one point in time, I thought I wanted to be an exercise physiologist. So I have done psychology and biochemistry and anatomy. So I've actually experienced a lot of different
Mm,
things in higher education. Yeah, and certainly the way that things are presented does differ on what you're trying to achieve from the different objectives in the different discipline groups. So yeah, absolutely.
mm. I mean,
Mm.
again, sorry, I keep talking. If other people want to take the mic and make comments, please put up your virtual hand using the hands up symbol. We're happy to hear from you as well. I mean, this is somewhat of one of my areas as well. I did a national project on creating authentic exam questions. And you can look up transformingexams.com if you want to find out more. But we were looking at ideas of using the tools of the trade within the exam, so taking it a bit further beyond a multiple choice, but allowing students to use, say, accounting software or a spreadsheet
Mm.
tool, or a programming development kit, or a multimedia tool to create complex constructed responses within the context of doing an exam. Call it a micro project, really. Um,
Yes.
so, and LMS systems like Moodle, and I think probably Blackboard and Canvas, allow you to attach files to quiz questions as part of the response. I
Yes,
know
we
Moodle
certainly,
does anyway. So you can
yeah,
have differing degrees or differing that, maybe the presentation of a multiple choice style drop down box is not right for you. You can think about using the tools in the LMS differently. So the file attachment feature, for example, to allow students to interrogate a spreadsheet or create a little computer program or watch and respond to a presentation slide set and get students to change things and submit their changed versions. It does mean that you probably can't automatically mark a lot of that,
yes.
but certainly I think the idea of that spectrum of authenticity in assessment is certainly a lot more possible, and I think we can take things as practitioners a lot further than we traditionally have been, even within that context of the exam space.
And we certainly,
Yeah,
we're at UTS in accounting, in our second year costing subjects, we've given students databases and said, analyze this, give us suggestions of how we can improve the costing of the organisation. Um, so yeah, I mean, that was an absolutely authentic thing that a student would need to be able to do. And we taught them how to use pivot tables in Excel. So that would be the quick way to to analyze that data. But then, of course, that's certainly not being automatically marked. You definitely need to
yeah.
read what the students do. But yeah, it is bringing those authentic experiences within the space.
Mm. I mean, the other thing I would add that there are different tools out there. So depending on, again, what tool set you've got available to you in your institution. For example, the Stack plugins, the Stack system for maths and STEM and that plugs into Moodle provides a huge range of question possibilities. It's essentially a programmable environment. And another one that comes to mind is Code Runner by Richard Lobb out of Canterbury in New Zealand. Again, a plug-in to Moodle that will evaluate computer programming problems as if it was a quiz question. Um, so I think, and different systems, the Weirist, I think Weirist Quizzes is another one that plugs into Moodle, a commercial software package that allows students to handwrite mathematical responses and it will read them. Granted, they're relatively simple mathematical formulas, but I think there are certainly possibilities for different kinds of authentic assessment tools out there that perhaps are underutilized in our system. Oh, ETH Zurich has got a nice hand-drawn response question type for Moodle as well. So you could have students draw a little diagram to represent their response.
Yep.
So yeah, I think there's a lot out there. Mike has asked, can you use peer marking for things that cannot be automatically marked? That would be an interesting one. Getting students to peer mark each other's online exams. That would depend on the capabilities of the LMS and their permissions, I suppose, whether you got access to be able to give permissions to other students to peer mark, or perhaps you could download the results and get them to peer mark that way.
Yep. Yeah, you'd certainly be wanting to think of privacy issues as well around that.
Perhaps better for a formative activity rather than summative.
Yeah, I was going to say I've
mm,
I've experienced something like that in a formative capacity. Well, actually, it was sort of part of the summative assessment in terms of what we had to do is we submitted a assignment and then we got 3 assignments, which I'm pretty sure they made was an easy. Sorry, it was a good assignment, a mediocre assignment, and a poor assignment, probably based on
mm,
students' prior achievement levels. And then we had to mark it against the marking criteria and give feedback as a peer review. Yeah, and I mean, it was a really great experience as a student to do that because you then really understood what you were looking for in terms of of hitting the marking criteria. And so then when you got your feedback back from 3 people, you could then really improve your assignment. So
yep.
yeah,
Yeah.
really good.
Yeah, that really helps students' evaluative judgment.
Mm.
Tim has mentioned that peer marking is a different sort of activity with different workflow for students. So, I mean, you would be essentially setting up an activity where students would submit a file or submit a bunch of text, and then students can peer review each other. So that feature is in Moodle. I'm pretty sure it's in Blackboard. I'm not sure about Canvas because I've never used Canvas, but I seem to remember there's a peer and self-evaluation activity in Blackboard as well. And Matthias has made a comment there. Peer review plugin from Feedback Fruits is also included. As it could be as a plugin system as well. So yeah, third-party systems that can plug into your LMS, I think really can expand that landscape quite considerably. But then it comes down to what sort of, is it a formative or is it a summative? Is it supposed to be time unseen exam? Is it supposed to be more open? Making those decisions around your assessment design, how far you can push authenticity within the context of a supervised online exam, for example, or an unseen exam. About your assessment mix, I guess, at the end of the day. Sometimes the exam is the wrong format, but we know that.
Yep. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, folks, we're almost at the end of the hour. Things are getting a lot more quieter. Just looking to see if there's anything there. Can't see any more questions at this time. Any last minute questions, people, comments, or links to resources that you care to share? Okay, thank you very much, Raechel. I think we'll wrap it up here. We'll have an early mark, as they say. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining. I will just briefly explain what's happening in the next session. So we'll be having a session on student perspectives on audio feedback. This is a joint session with the Assessment and Higher Education Network. You can find details of the next session on our website, to be held on the 1st of June. And it will also be in the email notice. If you've signed up for our newsletter, you'll get a notification of the session recording and information on the next session, as well as other similar kinds of online sessions to do with assessment by others as well. So thanks very much, folks, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Oops, I meant to stop the recording.